Hey guys, it is Wednesday, the 9th of October. Okay, listen, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a review of your first three sections, the Old Testament. So that is the three chapters are the covenant, the Ten Commandments, and the prophets. So what I'm going to do is all of those words on my word wall, I'm going to go over with you right now. I have a copy in front of me, and if you guys want to find them, they're on your Google Classroom, and they are also on your teacher page. All right, and now they're on YouTube. They let anybody on there apparently. Okay, so when we talk about a covenant, don't bog yourself down with, oh gosh, this is another word. Guys, all the covenant means is an agreement. And the agreement that we're referring to is the agreement between God and Abraham. Okay, this is the first time. Another term we're going to talk about is monotheism. This is the first time you're going to see a monotheistic faith. Okay, another word that we see in here is the Tanakh. That is a Hebrew word for what we Christians or the Western world calls the Old Testament. Okay, so Jews and Christians alike regard the Old Testament as Holy Scripture. Okay, Canaan is the promised land that is on your terms. You remember the agreement that God and Abraham made is Abraham would take his family to Canaan, and they would worship one monotheistic God. That was Abraham's part of the deal. God's part of the deal was he promised, you remember, he promised ancestors and descendants as many as there were stars in the sky, or as many as there were sands on the beaches. Okay, so we've covered the terms covenant, Tanakh, Canaan, and monotheism. Remember, monotheism, the belief in one God. Theism, God or gods. Belief in gods. And mono, obviously, if your math teacher hears you and you don't know that one, you're in trouble. All right. Now, the story of the sacrifice, Abraham's sacrifice to God. Remember, it was not uncommon at that time for people to sacrifice maybe their first head of cattle, or their first or their best sheep. It was also not uncommon for someone to sacrifice their firstborn son. And Abraham was going to do this. He was going to sacrifice his son Isaac. Isaac was born of his wife Sarah. And as he went to do this, according to the Old Testament, he was spoken to, and this was no longer the case. You no longer had to make this human sacrifice. That this relationship between God and Abraham had taken away the responsibility of a human sacrifice. All right. The term patriarch, when we talk about Judaism, we talk about maybe the head of Judaism, or where did Judaism start. We talk about it's a patriarchal religion. It starts with Abraham. Okay, and there's also another word, matriarch. That would be a woman who might have been the head of something, or who has started something. Okay, so that's where you get papa and mama, patriarch, matriarch. Okay. Now let's go on to Moses. Moses was born into slavery. At that time when he was born, the Jewish population was exploding. The Jewish slaves in Egypt the population was exploding. So the Egyptians, in order to protect their kingdom, had ordered the killing of the boys between 0 and 2 years old. So they were rounding up the babies and killing them. As they did this, some of the parents became aware of this. Some tried to flee. Moses' mother and family, they put him in a basket, sent him down the Nile River, hoping that somebody would find him. And indeed, according to the Old Testament, the person who finds him is the Pharaoh's wife. and he is raised as an Egyptian prince. He later finds out of his Jewish background. He flees Egypt and comes back in order to set his people free. And when he comes, his brother Ramses II is not too pleased about the whole idea. He says, "No, I'm not going to set your people free." And then, according to the Old Testament, 10 plagues were set upon the Egyptians, and the last one being the angel of death that took every firstborn son from the home where they died, except for the households where a sacrificial lamb with the blood of a lamb was spread across the hearth of the home. So if this happened according to the Old Testament, the angel of death would pass over. And of course, fittingly, when one of the most famous Jewish holidays is Passover, which celebrates the exodus of the Jews from Egypt. Okay, that's an easy way to remember that. Passover, plagues, Passover, exodus from Egypt. And exodus, just another word for exodus, means exit. Okay? All right. After this, after their freedom, they go into the Sinai Peninsula, okay, part of the Arabian desert. And according to the Old Testament, God delivers 10 commandments to Moses. Moses then delivers these to the people, and they wander the wilderness for 40 years. Moses never makes it out of the wilderness. Okay? He will die before he gets out of the wilderness. The people demand a king. When they finally get to Canaan, they get back home, they demand a king. Well, here's a problem. You have the Philistines who are already living there, and they don't want to leave their place. They've been there for hundreds of years, while the Jews have been in captivity. And so the Israelites fight the Philistines. One of the most famous battles being a little shepherd boy by the name of David, who fights a big, huge giant by the name of Goliath. Goliath was almost 9 feet tall, was known to be a wonderful warrior on the battlefield, killed many men. And here's David, some little poet that's sitting around taking care of sheep and playing a harp, singing songs to God, writing poetry to God. And he goes out on the battlefield and he defeats Goliath, becomes a huge hero to the Hebrews, and eventually will become king because of his popularity. The king at that time was a guy by the name of Saul. Saul becomes extremely jealous of David. Long story short, Saul dies, David becomes king. David will be king for a long time, starts to establish a tabernacle, a temple, and he never finishes it. His son Solomon will finish the tabernacle. Okay, let's see what else. There's a couple other terms that I want to go over with you. All right, some major terms that I definitely want you guys to make sure and familiarize yourself with, or stay familiarized with. When we talk about synagogues, well, it's easy for us in the Western world to talk about church, and then we just automatically assume everything's a church. Oh, Muslims have a church, or Jews have a church. Well, kinda. They do have places of worship. We in the Christian faith call our places of worship churches or cathedrals, so forth and so on. In Judaism, you will go to a synagogue. In Islam, you will go to mosque. All right. So that is the. Okay. So that is what a synagogue is. And guys, you hear me talk about the Torah a lot. The Torah is just the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Okay, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. what stories that you will find in the Torah are creation, the story of Abraham. You could even talk about Noah, okay, the story of Noah and the flood, and Moses, okay. So those are the major stories that you will find in the books of the Torah, or another name for it is the Pentateuch or the Pentateuch. All right, we talked about Passover. Oh, kosher foods, a way of eating the Jewish diet, which sets guidelines for what is pure and impure foods. Okay, we talked briefly about the history of Judaism when they were in captivity by the Greeks. You remember once upon a time, Alexander the Great comes through. He conquers pretty much the entire known world. He passes away at like 33 years old. Well, there were other kings that came along after him, and in the Jewish-held area at the time, the Greek kings wanted to stop this monotheistic faith. So one of the Greek kings, in all of his brilliant thoughts, decides to slaughter a pig and pour the blood of the pig all over the tabernacle. And there were some Jews that decided this step was too far. Okay, this had taken one step too far. A Jewish leader by the name of Judas Maccabeus leads a group of rebels to fight against the Greek soldiers. They end up fighting and taking back their tabernacle. This was, earlier in the year we read about the bronze bow, okay? We talked about the term zealot. Well, I just said rebels. This is basically the same thing. The rebels are going to be the predecessor of, later we see the zealots. They are the same thing, or we can also call them the Maccabees. They are going to eventually even fight the Romans. The Romans will finally quell the rebellions, but that'll be many years later. But this, guys, this cleansing of the tabernacle, remember the pig blood and everything, this cleansing of the tabernacle is, to this day, it's still a holiday about the cleansing of the tabernacle, and that holiday is Hanukkah. Okay, so if you've ever wondered what Hanukkah is that, some people say, oh, that's the equivalent to Christmas. No, not really. Not really. It's around the same time. We celebrate them around the same time, but no, it is not the same. All right. Well, I think that we're going to call that a day on your video. We do have a couple more terms, but what I'm going to do is tomorrow I'm going to talk about the life of Jesus and the terms that we have gone over for the life of Jesus. Okay, thanks guys.